Jayden Carter locked eyes with Professor Hastings, his fists clenched beneath the desk as she smirked, her voice dripping with condescension. "Perhaps math isn't for everyone, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut. The class chuckled under their breath, but Jayden didn't flinch. He had spent his whole life proving people wrong, and today would be no different. Professor Eleanor Hastings was a name that carried both admiration and fear among students at Westwood University. Her calculus class was not just a course, it was a battlefield. Students either emerged victorious, proving their worth, or they crumbled under the pressure of her sharp tongue and even sharper intellect. She took pride in weeding out the undeserving, as she called them, those who she believed lacked the intellectual rigor to master mathematics at her level. And today, as she scanned her classroom with an air of quiet authority, her gaze locked onto Jayden Carter. Jayden had always been an enigma to her. He was neither disruptive nor particularly engaged. He never raised his hand, never asked questions, and never seemed to be taking notes with the same frantic energy as the other students. Yet, despite his seemingly indifferent attitude, he always scored well on assignments. Too well. Something about him irked her, and she had decided today was the day to expose whatever it was, whether arrogance, laziness, or sheer luck. "Mr. Carter?" she called out suddenly, her voice carrying a distinct challenge. The class quieted instantly. Jayden, who had been resting his chin on his hand, blinked and looked up. "Yes, Professor?" She tapped her fingers against the desk, her eyes gleaming with something between curiosity and calculation. "Since you seem so unbothered by my lectures, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your understanding of today's topic." She turned to the board and, with a flourish, wrote down an integral so complex that even her best students would hesitate before attempting it. The murmurs in the classroom grew louder as students leaned forward, whispering among themselves. "That looks insane. Even Kyle would struggle with that. Does she expect him to solve it?" Jayden, however, remained seated, staring at the board with a small, almost amused smile playing at the corner of his lips. He didn't look nervous. If anything, he looked entertained. "Well?" Professor Hastings crossed her arms, tapping her foot. "Or should I assume you don't have an answer?" Jayden sighed dramatically before standing up. He stretched as if he had all the time in the world, then strolled to the front of the class with the ease of someone going for a casual walk. Picking up the chalk, he examined the problem for a few seconds. Then, without hesitation, he began writing. The first few steps were fluid, precise, and confident. The classroom had fallen into complete silence. Students exchanged bewildered glances. Even those who had expected him to fail were now watching with interest. The speed at which Jayden's hand moved was unnatural, calm yet deliberate, as if he wasn't just solving the problem, but playing with it. Professor Hastings' smirk faltered. She had expected hesitation, an awkward attempt, followed by an embarrassed retreat. Instead, what she was witnessing was something entirely different. Jayden put down the chalk and turned to face her. "That should do it." She narrowed her eyes and stepped forward, scanning his work. Her fingers clenched slightly at her sides. Every step was correct. Every transformation was elegant. There were no mistakes, no wasted steps, no unnecessary calculations, just pure, effortless precision. The room remained frozen in stunned silence as the realization spread. Jayden Carter had solved one of the hardest problems she had ever put on the board, and he had done it in less than a minute. Professor Hastings' jaw tightened. "This is impressive," she said, her voice measured. "But surely you've seen this problem before." Jayden tilted his head, feigning thoughtfulness. "Nope. First time." The whispers started again. Some students barely contained their grins. Others were outright gaping at him. Professor Hastings straightened her posture. "Then perhaps that was just luck. Let's try another." She turned back to the board and, this time, wrote something even more difficult, an integral that would normally require advanced techniques from upper-level courses. She stepped aside, folding her arms again. "Let's see if you can handle this one." Jayden chuckled. "You sure you want to do this, Professor?" There was an unmistakable challenge in his voice, one that made the other students lean in, sensing the tension between them. He picked up the chalk once more, and within seconds, the room fell back into its earlier trance. As Jayden worked through the problem, it became apparent that this wasn't just intelligence. This was something beyond what they had seen before. He was thinking at a level that was almost surreal, making connections and simplifications that others wouldn't even consider. The air grew thick with a mixture of awe, disbelief, and anticipation. This time, even Professor Hastings remained silent as he stepped back from the board, dusting the chalk from his hands. "There," he said. "All done." The professor stared at the board. The students held their breath, waiting for her reaction. Then, from the doorway, another voice spoke. "That's remarkable." All heads turned. Standing at the entrance was Dr. Isaac Reynolds, the head of the mathematics department. His eyes were fixed on Jayden's solution, his expression one of pure astonishment. Professor Hastings stiffened. The last thing she had expected today was for the department head to witness this. Dr. Reynolds stepped inside, his gaze shifting to Jayden. "Where did you learn to solve problems like this?" Jayden simply smiled. "Oh, here and there." The classroom was completely still. Professor Hastings, for the first time in years, had nothing to say. Professor Hastings stood rigid, her fingers curled slightly at her sides as she stared at the board. The perfect solution glared back at her, mocking her assumptions. The room was so quiet that the faint scratching of a student's pencil could be heard from the back. Jayden Carter had just done the impossible, not once, but twice. And now, the head of the mathematics department was here, witnessing it all. Dr. Isaac Reynolds stepped fully into the classroom, like his eyes still scanning the board, absorbing every detail of Jayden's solution. He was an older man, well respected in academic circles, known for his keen eye for talent. But what he was seeing now? This was beyond mere talent. It was brilliance. "Interesting," Dr. Reynolds finally said, his voice calm yet filled with curiosity. "Professor Hastings, is this your problem set?" Professor Hastings cleared her throat, forcing herself to regain her composure. "Yes," she said, her tone carefully measured. "I presented Mr. Carter with these problems as a way to assess his understanding." Jayden let out a quiet chuckle, clearly hearing the shift in her wording. It wasn't a test anymore. It wasn't meant to humiliate him. Now it was just an assessment. Dr. Reynolds nodded slightly, then turned his attention to Jayden. "Tell me, have you participated in any mathematical competitions, Olympiads, research groups?" Jayden shrugged. "Not really my thing." Professor Hastings' lips pressed into a thin line. "You expect us to believe that you've developed this level of mathematical reasoning without formal training?" Jayden smiled lazily, leaning against the desk. "Expect? No. But believe it or not, I just like math." A ripple of whispers passed through the students. Some of them still couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Jayden Carter, the kid who rarely spoke in class, was holding his ground against two of the most respected mathematicians on campus, like it was nothing. Professor Hastings, unwilling to let her authority slip any further, took a step forward. "Then let's see just how deep your understanding goes." Her voice had regained some of its sharpness. "Anyone can memorize solutions, Mr. Carter. Real mathematicians innovate." Dr. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "You have another challenge in mind?" Professor Hastings picked up a piece of chalk and, with deliberate strokes, began writing. This time, she wasn't merely presenting a complex integral. This was something entirely different, a theoretical problem rooted in number theory, one that required abstract thinking and creative problem-solving beyond standard calculus. Jayden watched her write, his expression unreadable. As she finished, she stepped back, folding her arms. "If you're as gifted as you claim, let's see you tackle this." The class held its breath. This wasn't just a problem. This was a trap, a way to prove that Jayden's brilliance was limited to pattern recognition, that when faced with something truly challenging, he would falter. Jayden stared at the board for a moment, tilting his head slightly. His fingers tapped idly against the desk. Then, without a word, he walked up and grabbed the chalk. This time, he didn't dive in immediately. He stood there, analyzing. Students exchanged glances, some whispering that maybe, finally, he had met his match. But then, Jayden began writing, slowly at first, then faster. Unlike before, where his solutions were effortless and fluid, this time his work was methodical. He broke the problem into sections, redefining it in ways that weren't immediately obvious. He wasn't just solving it, he was unraveling it, exposing hidden layers of complexity that even Professor Hastings hadn't fully considered. Dr. Reynolds watched with growing interest. "Fascinating," he murmured under his breath. Professor Hastings, despite herself, was beginning to feel something unfamiliar, something she hadn't felt in years. A strange, reluctant admiration. Jayden paused, tapping the chalk against his palm as if considering something. Then, with a final series of equations, he finished. He stepped back, turned to face the class, and grinned. That should do it. Professor Hastings approached the board, scrutinizing every detail. Her sharp eyes darted between each line, looking for errors, inconsistencies, anything to disprove what she was seeing. There were none. Slowly, she turned back toward Jayden, her face unreadable. The class sat on the edge of their seats, waiting for her response. Dr. Reynolds exhaled a quiet laugh. This level of intuition is rare, he said. Very rare. He turned to Jayden. Tell me, what name do you publish under? The question cut through the air like a knife. A few students frowned in confusion. Publish? Jayden ran a hand through his hair, looking almost embarrassed. Ah, right, about that. Professor Hastings narrowed her eyes. You don't mean to say, Dr. Reynolds snapped his fingers, realization dawning on his face. J.C. Matthews. Gasps filled the room. Every student turned to Jayden in shock. Professor Hastings took a step back. That's impossible. J.C. Matthews was a legend, a prodigy. The anonymous mathematician who had solved an unsolved equation at MIT last year, one that had baffled even the greatest minds. Papers written under that name had been referenced in academic journals across the world. Jayden stuffed his hands into his pockets. Well, technically, my full name is Jayden Carter Matthews. So yeah, that's me. The weight of his words settled over the classroom. The whispers turned into full conversations as students tried to process what they had just learned. Professor Hastings' mind raced. A year ago, the university had rejected a scholarship application from a J.C. Matthews, dismissing it as lacking proper academic references. She had been the one to sign the rejection letter. She swallowed hard. Jayden had applied here. She had turned him away. And now he had returned. Not as a struggling student, but as a mathematical genius who had just proven her wrong in front of the entire class. The atmosphere in the classroom was still thick with shock. Jayden had just turned the academic world on its head in a matter of minutes. He had walked in as a student, underestimated and disregarded, and now he stood as a mathematical prodigy, one whose name had already reached the highest levels of academia. Professor Hastings still hadn't moved. She stood near her desk, just fingers curled tightly around the edge as if gripping onto something tangible would help steady the chaos unraveling inside her mind. A part of her refused to believe what had just happened. But the equations on the board, the undeniable proof of his brilliance, made denial impossible. The whispers around the room grew louder, students exchanging stunned glances. Some of them had heard the name J.C. Matthews before, had read about the mysterious young mathematician whose work had been cited in prestigious journals. And now he was standing right in front of them, disguised as an ordinary student. Jayden, for his part, looked completely unfazed. He had been through this before, the shift in how people saw him. It was always the same. The moment people discovered his identity, their attitudes changed. Respect from those who had ignored him, envy from those who felt threatened. Skepticism from those who couldn't accept that someone like him could be so gifted. Dr. Reynolds was the only one who seemed genuinely excited. He chuckled, shaking his head as he stepped closer to Jayden. You know, I've read your work. In fact, I've referenced it myself in one of my recent lectures, but I never imagined I'd meet the mind behind it in my own department. Jayden smirked slightly. Guess I like keeping things interesting. Professor Hastings' voice was tight when she finally spoke. Why are you here, Mr. Carter? Jayden turned to face her fully, raising an eyebrow. I already answered that. No, she said, shaking her head. You gave an excuse. I want the real reason. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. He had expected her to still push back. Even after everything, she wasn't the type to let go easily. He sighed, shifting his weight. Fine. The truth, I wanted to see what it felt like to just be a student. Yes, and I had no expectations. No people treating me like a trophy to be paraded around. Just me, math, and a chance to learn on my own terms. There was a pause as the words settled between them. Professor Hastings studied him carefully. And yet, you hid who you really were. Jayden tilted his head slightly. Would you have treated me the same if you knew? The question landed like a strike. She inhaled sharply, but she didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. She wouldn't have. She would have scrutinized him differently, challenged him more, or maybe even found a way to bring him into a specialized program that would pull him away from the normal student experience he wanted. Jayden continued, his voice calm but firm. I get it. You thought I didn't belong. You saw me and assumed I was just another student trying to scrape by. And when I didn't give you the answers you expected, you pushed harder, hoping to expose my weaknesses. But here's the thing, Professor. What you saw as weakness was me holding back. Not because I wasn't capable, but because I wanted to see how far you'd take it. Professor Hastings exhaled through her nose, crossing her arms. And what did you learn? Jayden gave her a small smile, but there was something sharp beneath it, that even the smartest people in the room can be wrong. The tension between them was palpable. For the first time in a long while, Professor Hastings felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. She had built her reputation on being right, on knowing her students better than they knew themselves. But Jayden had shattered that confidence in a single afternoon. Dr. Reynolds watched the exchange with interest. You do realize this changes everything, don't you? He said, turning to Jayden. You can't exactly stay in an ordinary undergraduate class now. People are going to want to put you in more advanced research. You could be leading projects, working alongside top mathematicians. Jayden sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, I figured. And you don't seem thrilled about it. Jayden chuckled dryly. Let's just say I was enjoying my anonymity. Professor Hastings narrowed her eyes. You can't expect people to ignore what you just did. Jayden shrugged. I never expected them to. I just hoped I'd have a little longer before they noticed. There was a long silence. Then, finally, Professor Hastings let out a slow breath, nodding. I misjudged you. Jayden raised an eyebrow. Is that an apology? She pursed her lips. It's an acknowledgement. Jayden smirked. Close enough. Dr. Reynolds clapped his hands together. Well, whatever you decide, Mr. Carter, one thing is certain, you have a future far beyond this classroom. Jayden sighed. Yeah, I know. As he picked up his bag and made his way toward the door, he could feel the weight of 100 stares on him. He had come into this class wanting to blend in, but now there was no going back, and for the first time, he wasn't sure how he felt about that. The class had ended, but no one had truly moved on. The students still lingered, some whispering in hushed voices, others sneaking glances at Jayden as if he had suddenly become a celebrity overnight. The transformation was almost amusing. Hours ago, he had been just another face in the crowd, overlooked and underestimated. Now, his name carried a weight none of them had anticipated. Jayden took his time packing his things, unfazed by the attention. He was used to this reaction. Whenever someone found out about J.C. Matthews, the shift was always the same. Curiosity, admiration, disbelief. But something about today felt different. Maybe it was because this time he hadn't been exposed by an article or an award. This time he had been forced into the spotlight by someone who had wanted to prove him a fraud. Professor Hastings remained at her desk, tapping her fingers against the polished wood deep in thought. She wasn't a woman who liked surprises, and Jayden had proven to be the biggest surprise of all. Her sharp mind replayed every interaction she'd had with him, every unspoken assumption she had made. She had been convinced he was indifferent, maybe even lazy. Now she realized he had been watching, learning, and holding back, either as an act of defiance or a quiet form of self-preservation. Dr. Reynolds had left with an approving nod, undoubtedly already drafting ways to recruit Jayden for something bigger. But Jayden had no interest in that, not yet. As he slung his backpack over his shoulder and made his way toward the door, Professor Hastings finally spoke. Mr. Carter. Jayden paused, glancing over his shoulder. She studied him for a long moment before sighing. You knew, didn't you? His eyebrow lifted slightly. Knew what? Her voice was quieter now, less sharp, but still holding that unmistakable edge. That I rejected your application last year. The corner of his lips twitched, not in amusement, but in something close to acknowledgement. I had my suspicions. Professor Hastings inhaled through her nose, pressing her lips together before finally admitting that was a mistake. Jayden turned fully toward her now, his expression unreadable. He didn't look smug or victorious. If anything, he seemed understanding. Yeah, he said simply. It was. She exhaled, shaking her head. Why didn't you say anything? When you got in, when you saw me for the first time, you could have thrown it in my face, exposed me in front of everyone. Jayden tilted his head slightly. And what would that have accomplished? That answer caught her off guard. She had expected some level of resentment, some need for retribution, but there was none. Just a quiet confidence, a certainty that he didn't need to seek revenge to prove his worth. I didn't come here to fight you, he continued. I came here to learn. You underestimated me. It happens. It wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last. Something in her chest twisted uncomfortably. She had spent years building a reputation as one of the toughest professors in the department, a gatekeeper of excellence. She prided herself on recognizing talent and nurturing the best minds. And yet, here was living proof that she had failed to see what had been right in front of her. Jayden gave her a small nod, as if offering an unspoken truce, and turned to leave. But before he reached the door, she called out again, "Mr. Carter." He stopped, waiting. She hesitated, then finally said, "For what it's worth, I won't make that mistake again." Jayden smiled, a real one this time. Good. And with that, he was gone. The classroom felt strangely empty without him, and for the first time in a long while, Professor Hastings found herself staring at the blank board, realizing that perhaps the lesson learned today hadn't been for her students, it had been for her. Jayden walked across campus, his mind buzzing with the events of the day. The moment he had been trying to avoid had finally come. His secret was out. The name J.C. Matthews, which had once been just an abstract figure in the academic world, now had a face attached to it. And that face belonged to him. He could already feel the shift. People he had passed 100 times before were suddenly looking at him differently. Some whispered, others pointed, a few even stopped to stare outright. It wasn't the first time he had experienced this, but it was different now. Before, it had been distant admiration, his name printed in journals, his equations debated by scholars who didn't know him personally. Now it was real. Jayden sighed as he reached the library. He had hoped to have more time before everything changed. But time, he had learned, was never something he could control. As he stepped inside, he felt a presence behind him. He turned slightly to see Professor Hastings standing just a few feet away. She wasn't her usual imposing self. There was something in her posture that was almost hesitant. "I thought I might find you here," she said, her voice measured. Jayden leaned against the nearest bookshelf, crossing his arms. "And why's that?" She glanced around at the quiet aisles, then back at him. "Because I made a mistake. And if I know anything about you now, it's that you don't waste time dwelling on things that don't matter." Jayden tilted his head slightly. "So what does matter?" Professor Hastings sighed, rubbing her temples for a moment before folding her arms. "What you do next." Jayden let out a small chuckle. "That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?" She studied him for a long moment. "You know, when I first started teaching, I thought the most important part of my job was separating the great from the good. I built my reputation on it, on setting the bar so high that only the most dedicated could reach it. But you changed that." Jayden raised an eyebrow. "How so?" She exhaled, shaking her head. "Because you didn't need my validation. You didn't need my approval, my challenges, or my lessons. You were always beyond them. And I was so focused on maintaining my authority in the classroom that I never stopped to ask myself what I was actually proving." Jayden remained silent, letting her words settle. She continued, her voice softer now. "I wanted to humble you, to test you. But the truth is, I was the one who needed humbling." Jayden didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply nodded. "People underestimate me all the time. It's nothing new." "That doesn't make it right," she said. A silence stretched between them before she finally added, "Dr. Reynolds wants to recommend you for an advanced program, one that would push your abilities far beyond what you're doing now." Jayden glanced away, letting her words sink in. "And what do you think?" Professor Hastings hesitated. "I think you should do what you want to do, not what people expect of you." That made him smirk. "That almost sounds like advice." She shook her head. "No, just an observation." Jayden looked at her carefully. This was a different version of Professor Hastings, the one not shaped by pride, but by reflection. He respected that. "I'll think about it," he said finally. She nodded, accepting that answer. As she turned to leave, she paused once more. For what it's worth, I do see it now. Not just the genius, but the way you think beyond the formulas. That's rare. Jayden smiled faintly. Thanks, Professor. She gave him one last look before walking away, disappearing into the library aisles. Jayden exhaled, leaning against the bookshelf again. The world had changed for him today, but in the end, it wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It wasn't about revenge or recognition. It was about something bigger. He had learned long ago that being underestimated wasn't a burden. It was an advantage. Let them doubt. Let them assume. Because when the moment came to reveal the truth, it would always speak louder than anything else. And as he walked toward a quiet study corner, opening a new notebook to scribble down his latest ideas, he realized that the greatest lesson of all wasn't about intelligence or prestige. It was about knowing your own worth, even when others didn't see it yet.